Well, good morning, colleagues. It's wonderful to see you today. I would like to offer my welcome to all of my distinguished colleagues, honored guests, and my esteemed colleagues here on the stage. My name is Ellen Wagner, and it is my honor to convene this session, this conversational plenary, to explore just where we are going to be taking education in the future. I expect that's been an issue on everyone's mind. And being here this last week, listening to the conversations, I have to tell you that for me, the issues continue to even swirl beyond that. So I am excited to have all of you here, from researchers and professors, understanding how learning happens, ministers trying to figure out how to make this stuff work in practice, startup people who are trying to take these ideas and turn them into actionable ideas that actually produce results. Thank you for all the expertise that everybody here in the room brings to this conversation. And with that, I'd like to get us started with an introduction of our speakers. I have bios for all of our speakers. They are from the program, but I am going to take the time to read them because I'd like you to know who we are going to be hearing from today. To begin, we have Dr. Shafika Isaacs. Shafika is the Chief of Section for Technology and AI in Education at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. As an international specialist in digital learning, AI, and education, she has spent the past 2 years and 2.5 decades on building communities, coaching professionals, and leading global, regional, and national digital learning initiatives. She also serves as professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg, has contributed to UNESCO's AI competency framework for teachers, advised UNICEF on AI and children, and led research on AI in African primary education systems with the Link Center at Wits University. She has supported national, local, and global organizations on digital learning policy and large-scale education programs. As the founding executive director of SchoolNet Africa, she helped pioneer equitable, justice-driven integration of technology in African schools across 16 African countries. She has served on multiple governance boards, earned prestigious leadership awards, and published widely on digital education. Shafika holds a PhD in education, an executive MBA with distinction, and a master's degree in science and technology policy. So Shafika, welcome. I would also like to introduce Professor Niall Winters. Professor Niall Winters is a practitioner researcher concentrating on technological practice for positive social change. He is the founder of OpenStrand, a startup focusing on widening access to global knowledge in the cultural sector. He does this through the development of convivial technologies, and I must tell you, I'm looking forward to hearing about convivial technologies. Niall is a full professor of education and technology at the University of Oxford, where he co-led the Critical Digital Education Research Group, directed the Master's of Educational Digital and Social Change, and is a visiting fellow of Kellogg College. He has published widely on the equitable design and use of educational technologies, particularly for those at the periphery of society. So, Niall, welcome. I would like to also introduce Dr. Yong Zhao. He is a distinguished professor at the University of Kansas. He previously held leadership roles at the University of Oregon and Michigan State University, including as director of institutes focused on global education and education technology. He has also worked in Australia and as a scholar, worked in Australia and the UK, and as an elected member of the National Academy of Education. An internationally recognized scholar, Zhao has published over 100 articles and nearly 40 books on globalization, technology, and education reform. His recent titles include Focused, Duck and Cover, and Learning for Uncertainty. I'm happy to tell you that his newest book, Fix the Past or Invent the Future, Moving Beyond One-Size-Fits-All Education, has just been published, and I expect we're going to hear a little bit about that today. So with that, let me just finish the introduction. Over his 40-decade career, Zhao has led major research projects, developed software tools, and advised institutions across 5 continents. Born in Sichuan, China, he earned his PhD in education from the University of Illinois in 1996 and began his U.S. academic career at Michigan State University. So as you can tell, we have quite a distinguished panel of experts coming from varieties of perspectives on this, in this environment. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to move myself from up here in front, and I'm going to but I'm going to pose the question that we're going to be talking about really quickly. And the way we're going to begin with this opening question is to ask, how will education remain a force for inclusion, critical inquiry, and human connection in the intelligent age? And with that, we're going to have Dr. Isaacs come to the stage and speak to us on this notion of navigating conflicting narratives.
Sure, thank you very much, Ellen. I must say, when you were reading that biography, it felt like an obituary. And then, of course, they've mic'd me up, and now I feel like Madonna, without the Botox. So I thought that I took my cue from the first fantastic plenary where there was excellent, thought-provoking ideas, and one of the questions that were posed was, who are the we when we speak about humanity? And so I'm going to speak mainly from the perspective of my role at UNESCO, and to clarify that UNESCO has adopted a particular perspective on questions related to education and the role of technologies, not just AI, within that. So essentially, as a specialized UN agency working with 194 member states, we are mandated by member states to serve them in the policy domain, in the practice domain, and essentially we take a principle-centered approach to questions related to technologies in education. And that becomes important because it anchors our worldview in terms of how we approach very complex questions like the influence of generative AI in education and how that's evolving. And so it's important to state at the outset that whenever approaching any position, we ask questions about, does it sustain, protect human rights, inclusion, equity, our duty of care and ethics of care? Does it perpetuate, support human solidarity, social justice, environmental justice, and very importantly, especially in this historical moment, education as a public good? And I'll speak a lot more about that. And we do so in our role given an evolving global AI and education ecosystem. We do that as a global convener of governments, of ministers, of ministries of education, but we also work with a very large research network. We convene 1,100 UNESCO research chairs from universities across the world. And so that becomes the community that we convene together with our partners in the development space, in the private sector, and so on. And so leveraging that position as a global convener, we anchor the conversations, the issues on these foundational principles. Another important dimension of our role, in addition to being a laboratory of ideas where we can open up the conversation, explore new possibilities to achieve these noble principles and goals, we see ourselves also as a narrative shaper in the face of growing contested narratives on the issues of AI and education. And I want to pause here for a second and pay tribute to someone who taught me so much about narratives, about storyfying, about storytelling, about shaping stories, and that is Dr. Harold Ellison. May he rest in peace and powerfully in peace. He was one of the leading experts who worked at Online Educa Berlin for many, many years, and his memory is he's just spiritually present here, because in this room was the last time that I've also seen him, so I want to pay particular tribute to him for also teaching about the power of narratives and how an organization like UNESCO has a powerful role to shape important narratives, alongside also serving as a normative anchor. And many of you may be aware that we've published many guidances and normative frameworks on AI in education, which I'm not going to speak about too much. What I did want to focus on is that when engaging with ministers of education, with decision makers, with policy makers, because that is our remit, we are confronted with conflicting narratives that they have to contend with. And our job is to help engage, navigate, traverse these conflicting narratives by anchoring ourselves repeatedly in these foundational principles. So the conflicting narratives we know, sort of a jolt of the memory for those of us who've been in the educational technology space for very long, the claims of the affordances of AI, that it is a great equalizer of education, versus the fact that AI is in fact catalyzing deepening inequalities, or that it will replace teachers who do not use AI, that's the other qualification, versus, in fact, instead of investing in AI, we should be investing in the 44 million teachers that the world still needs to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. That there are tensions and contradictions and conflicting narratives around equity matters, but in fact, efficiency matters more, and a lot of the discourse is around ensuring that our systems are more efficient, sometimes and often at the expense of equity. And of course, personalized learning is the major affordance of AI, and often that is posed in a way that forgets that learning is in fact a social process and not a highly hyper-individualized process. So these are some of the conflicting narratives that we are navigating, and what they do is they pose the issues in binary terms. They are often acontextual, devoid of the actual realities that many ministries of education face. They are often instrumentalist, oversimplistic, solutionist is the word that comes to mind, and in most cases not grounded in evidence. And so how then do we navigate these spaces in the face of these conflicting narratives? And I want to talk a little bit about how that plays out in conversation. So just before I came here, I was called by a group of people who are wanting to service the United Nations system on scaling AI in education, and they want to develop a framework with UNESCO on how to scale AI in education. And I asked them, is that our purpose, to scale AI in education? Or is it to scale education as a public good in the age of AI? Different narrative. And it's again, it compels a different set of assumptions and a different creation of worlds through narratives if we pose the questions differently. Unfortunately, the dominant conversation is about scaling AI in education as if that is the ultimate objective. The second is that we have released a call for think pieces, and we had so many people submit, and going through those 800 think pieces, almost every single one of them frame AI as a trade-off. The first sentence, AI will revolutionize or is already shaping education and influencing education. There are opportunities and there are risks. And the framing is about the trade-off between opportunities and risks, and therefore our quest is to find a balance between trade-offs and risks. And we ask, again, in shaping the narrative, is that the way we need to frame the way we think and act and make policy decisions on this? Or do we frame AI and emerging technologies as a contested space, as a space that has to be negotiated, that there are different actors with different interests and different power dynamics that involves a contestation of power relations, and that is actually what we are negotiating. The third is that AI will be augmenting teacher agency if teachers are using AI, which all of these are not true. But again, is that the framing that we need to be working with on the assumption that there is no other choice, it is inevitable that we have to go the AI route for teachers to develop their agency? Or is the question, what kind of teacher do we need in the age of AI and intersecting vulnerabilities and crises and multiple forms of inequalities that are emerging? And we are shaping the narrative as UNESCO more in this sort of gray, 50 shades of gray area here. And so why are these conflicting narratives emerging is also because when we did a mapping of the AI in education stakeholder ecosystem, it was very telling that if we frame and observe what is going on in terms of the different actors in the ecosystem, there is a strong, very dominant, big technology, very powerful big technology firms linked to startups, venture capital, networks of donors, and so on. And on the lower power matrix is the many teachers and learners in the more marginalized communities, and that is, in fact, the power dynamic that is at play. And so that is informed by a dominant, marketized, commercialized logic that is informing the way AI and education is spoken about, the way we think about it, the way we act upon it. And most of those conversations potentially risk education as a public good and as an equalizing force. And that is the concern that we are wanting to address as well. The emerging and heightening competitiveness, the geopolitical tension that plays out in our education system through AI experimentation, and of course the power asymmetries. And so our response as a global convener, narrative shaper, and normative anchor is that the quest now is to reclaim and reimagine education as a global common good. And what we are proposing is that we join this wonderful community here and the global community in rethinking and reimagining and setting up spaces to reclaim education as a public good. We've published a publication called Reimagining Our Futures Together, where UNESCO calls for a new social contract on education that anchors our approach and education as a public good based on ethical values, human rights, human-centeredness, environmental sustainability, and an ethics and duty of care. And we've released a call for think pieces and published the AI in Education, Futures of Education. In it are a number of very intentional pieces that we've curated with the idea of catalyzing further the debates, opening up a global imagination towards directing us to public good investment in education. We've been inspired by some of the developments that have emerged recently, and that is where we would want to work with all of you and invite this global commons that we are wanting to convene towards investment, the university spaces, in particular public universities, investing in co-creating public digital goods. We were very inspired by the example of Switzerland, where the government and local think tanks have designed public open source AI models. It's perhaps the first scalable, government-led open source AI, LLMs and AI model that offers a window of what it might look like should we roll out a public goods approach to the design and delivery of AI. Yesterday, my colleague Mark West and Frank Capel and Carolina from ITU and UNICEF spoke about launching a charter on public digital learning in an initiative called Gateways to Public Digital Goods, public digital learning platforms, which is also an attempt to try and frame how do we proceed, how do we strategize around ensuring that education remains a public digital good. My colleague Zainab is here, who also leads a dynamic OER coalition, also opening up the conversations around growing the open movement in education and open education resources as well. And then finally is a question that when we convened all the private sector companies at UNESCO as well in this September this year, a very important question was posed. So how can we be involved? We want to be involved. And the question is, how do we engage with big tech companies, with small tech companies in this quest for ensuring that we sustain education as a public good? And we believe that there is a space for the private sector. And our open invitation is for an engagement, but with the understanding that we are anchored on the fundamental principles of an inclusive, equitable, ethical digital futures that are based on education as a public good. Thanks. I'm going to conclude on that note.
So this gives me an opportunity to ask you a question. Listening to the number of conflicting narratives and the levels at which these conversations are taking place, it seems almost overwhelming for most of us. How do we mere mortals who are trying to figure out how to do our daily work manage to keep ourselves from getting caught in this swirl?
Yes, I think overwhelm is a predominant condition for many of us who are leading these spaces. I think that in the context of growing complexity, volatility, ambiguity, etc., that what comes to mind, and we can work on what has worked historically, which is why the historical perspective is so important, is that we know that if we work on small wins that can catalyze bigger changes, we know that that has worked in educational technologies historically, so that where we've worked with communities, where we've built strong leadership, strong localized participation by learners, by teachers in a participatory models, that have tended to work. The challenge is that they've tended to work and stay at micro levels, at smaller levels, and that we've not really been successful in scaling them. And I think that that becomes the bigger conversation as to how. We can only know how if we work together and collective sense-making endeavors, which is what we are wanting to catalyze.
Thank you. It also reminds me that we have to continue to keep a conversation going, which is based upon where we need to do the work, not necessarily just jumping to the newest thing because we feel we must master that. Absolutely. That in fact we are grounded in our true work, and that continues even as we feel ourselves being pulled in different directions.
Absolutely. I think just responding to the newest thing is perhaps the problem. We have many, many examples of how, in fact, what David Niemer calls mundane technologies in localized communities have been very effective, have been very innovative in enabling learners how to read, in enabling, empowering teachers, communities, and so on. And so it's not about finding the next best, newest gadget, but that in fact that we look at a spectrum of how social systems can shape the use of technologies and the design of technologies for a particular purpose, and so it's the purposeful design that's important.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you. And it's a wonderful way to lead into Niall's comments because, of course, Professor Winters is going to be talking to us about the importance of reflecting on critical inquiry, because even as we are pushing and forging ahead in the future, we continue to be rooted in our research and in our practice and in our epistemologies. And so, Niall, I am interested in your takes on this.
Great, thank you very much. I'll stand at the podium, if that's okay. Morning, everyone. I'll pick up on some of the themes that Shafika mentioned. And also on some of the discussions I've had both here in the room and at the booths. So people I've been conversing with may recognize some of the discussion points we've had over the last couple of days. So my thanks to you as well for those conversations. So this is the question I'm going to talk about. Can AI in education be a force for inclusion, critical inquiry, as Alan mentioned, and human connection? Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of a critical stance on AI. So I just want to acknowledge that I do believe that generative AI is getting good, or AI is good at a number of things, some of which not a complete list there. Okay, so let's get back to the education side of things. So when we think about education, or we think about learning, or we think about practice, maybe we think about something like they're showing in these paintings, which is sort of, self-reflective, it's contemplative, it's perhaps, personal, right? But that's not all education is, right? So you might think about ideas of enrichment, ideas of community, from a point of view of teaching. You may get fulfillment from teaching through that, perhaps the service of teaching, right? So we can think about our students and their contribution to society, but also society's contribution to education. Shafika mentioned as well about education as a public good. Their students as part of the Roads Must Fall campaign in South Africa for free education a few years ago. And I think this quote from James Reed nicely sums up some of these ideas or ways of thinking, which is the flowering of each individual's personality and talents is the precondition for everyone's development. So that kind of leads to questions for those of us in higher education about sort of what is the role of education in society? What's the point of the university today? Right? What kinds of students do we want our students to be in this sort of digital age, or this age of AI that we've been talking about and discussing at the conference? So I'm going to pick up on some of those ideas. Where does technology fit in this way of thinking? Okay, so we could say that certainly ChatGPT came out sort of after COVID, or during that kind of period where students, or we all were, students and learners, sitting at home on Zoom, etc., right, in sort of what some people would call simulated social experiences. So the idea of coming together here for a conference or a meeting in a university campus sort of went away. And I guess part of that, ChatGPT following on that, had this idea that you're conversing sort of on your own, but with sort of this, non-embodied dialogue with AI. And in a heavier critique, some may say this led to a sort of a depersonalized of the university or higher education experience, right? Which enabled, or I would contend enabled, what might be called misuses of AI by students when that personalization is lost. I have a friend who's a teacher in Ireland, and he works very closely with his secondary school students over a 2 or 3 year period. And when ChatGPT came in, he could say, I immediately knew whether the student wrote it or not, because I had a good experience of their previous writing, their previous submissions, their previous essays. Right? Can we say the same in higher education? Okay. The other one is we've been talking about this motivation to what you might say or call AIifying the educational experience. So what does that mean? Right? You're looking at the slide going, Niall, put a lot of effort into your slides, a big purple rectangle. What's going on here? Okay, so I just want to point out, I don't know if you can see it, but here there's a little yellow pixel, right? So what that represents is the amount of money Apple spent to develop the iPhone, about $250 million. Okay, the big purple rectangle represents the expected capital expenditure from AI companies up till 2030, which is $5 trillion, right? Which is, to give you some context, that's the size, roughly the size of the German economy, right? So you wonder why there's motivation for the use of AI, right? And one of the ways people have looked at this is maybe talking about artificial and general intelligence or super intelligence. I don't believe in that at all. I think that's a complete distraction. Right, moving on. In our case, we've had a bit of top-down, which is sort of the integration, or we see an increased integration of AI into the university experience by universities themselves. And a lot of people in this room have been focused on that. So, ways, go back. Permitted uses of generative AI tools, support for staff in making changes to their assessment, productively integrating AI to the curriculum. These are all quite familiar to us, and this is from King's. Oxford have an AI competency centre. The University of Nairobi are doing a lot in this space as well, particularly in the healthcare space. So we've had kind of a top-down push. We've also had a bottom-up push. So this is the advertisements that some of you may have seen in the US for ChatGPT particularly being offered free to students during exams. But that's kind of the motivation that's on the billboards there. Right? So we've had this strong push for education. And this is despite, we've talked a lot about biases and issues around the harms of education, which I think we all know about. And despite the lot of work of data labelers, in Kenya, for example, and the mental health impact they've had to deal with and are advocating for better working conditions for themselves. And of course, the environmental impact. So the image on the right there, the image on the right there, these are natural gas generation plants, only 4 of them. I believe there's 16 for one data center for Grok in the US, right? So we've got the environmental impact, right? So it's no wonder then that, AI yesterday, as we saw in the word cloud, was picked as a key issue, right? And in some ways we're at, you might say, a moment of crisis. Which way are we going to go? And Shafika has talked about this as well. Talking about sort of Mark Fisher, it's now impossible to imagine a coherent alternative. In his case, he was talking about capitalism, but to AI, this kind of AI inevitability, and how might we address it? Is it the kind of AI we want, right? And we can think about this in 3 ways, which I'll come to in a second. Okay, so how might we address this? Okay, so I'm not here to sort of offer solutions. We're just going to think through questions to support our discussions, right? So how does AI align with your values and your approach to teaching? Okay. Next, looking at through a technical lens, think about Gen AI's technical constraints, which I'll briefly touch on. And then what might be an alternative? What's an alternative way of thinking about or evaluating or designing AI? And I'm going to frame that through convivial technologies, as Ellen mentioned. Okay. So speaking of value, sort of picking up on what Neil talked about yesterday, and particularly I'm interested in critical pedagogy, okay? And so critical pedagogy positions education as an act of social justice, because education is inherently political and pedagogy is emancipatory, okay? So that's the value I'm coming from. You may have a different one and that's okay, right? It's just answering that particular question. Okay, and just go into a bit of detail on that. There's a way of thinking about that. One, in the language of critical pedagogy, which I won't go into, right? You can think about sort of oppressive forces, right? So people's knowledge or local knowledges from various communities around the world may be seen as inferior, right? You'll see that often in a medical context. The curriculum is taken from somewhere else and imposed, right? Ideas of learners, or indeed, institutions as, dependent, okay, versus ideas of a teacher as co-learner, as a deep respect for people's histories and cultures, ideas of participation and ideas of bottom-up structures to confront these issues of power, right? And I would contend that we want to be moving in this direction, right, not the other one, okay? So just to pick the knowledge as example there, right? Knowledge is intentional, it's intentionally plural, it's not a typo. You can look at, decolonization, for example, and there's tons of work from majority world on that, which I won't go into here, but just references there for those who are interested. Okay, so that's kind of the ways of thinking about pedagogy and teaching and learning. Looking at technology then, so I would contend that Gen AI is, what we might say, maxing out, right? We're entering an era, I would say, of slowing down, right? So the improvements in models that we've seen, for example, between GPT-2 to 3 to 3.5 is not as strong as we might have seen from 4.5 to 5.1, okay? So the fundamentals are slowing down, okay? Well, what's happened? How was this built? Well, we all know all the issues of way and data was mined, copyright was overwritten, etc., to build these systems, to build the data or take the data training these systems, right? So I've touched on issues of bias, but when you talk to librarians, they spend a lot of time thinking about curation of the archive. So I think some of that kind of thinking may be helpful for us. 2 further quick points on this. One, English has obviously been the dominant language in which this training data has come. And so there's a cultural hegemony built into that, right? So you can build on top of your models, but you're building on top of biases, principles, values that are already built into this sort of English language archive. And some people have suggested, a technical suggestion, that a way around these issues to empower, if I could use that word, other countries around the world to move away from sort of, the 7 big providers is to develop small LLMs in a decentralized manner and then network them all together. But just to say that that's a massive technical challenge. Okay, so coming towards the end here, so we've got the pedagogical part, we've got the technical part, then we want to think about another way of thinking about technology, right? And one way to do that is to view it or think about it or evaluate it as a convivial technology. And I've highlighted there sort of 5 areas. That's how you frame and think about a convivial technology, right? And so what you can say is, in your own work or what you know of AI systems, how would you answer each of these questions, okay? And I would contend that AI systems, right, kind of get 1 out of the 5, 1.5 out of the 5. You may disagree. So, for example, number 4, the environmental impact is quite negative, right? So you can think about this as a frame and a way to think about how AI development or digital development can happen in the future. Okay, so to conclude then, I would say that universities are changing. A lot of the work we used to talk about before with technology and education was the university is really hard to change. As we've seen, I think that AIs have been, where universities have changed a lot to support AI. We've even seen that from the way they've asked students to engage with it, from kind of almost banning it in the early days, which doesn't seem too long ago, maybe sort of 2 years ago, right? You've got to understand the fundamental technical constraints around generative AI, focus on pedagogy and evaluation, and I would say by doing that, it opens up the space for dialogue around the creation of the inclusive, equitable, and decolonial future in education we want. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you, Niall. So I have a question for you.
Please.
You have been a critical theorist and a scholar for much of your career, and you have recently become a startup founder.
Yeah, that's putting it generously. Yeah, thank you.
just to put it in simple words. And I'm interested in some of the biggest surprises that you've had, because as I was listening to you talking about where things need to go, I know you have been compelled to take action in a way that I wonder if you had considered that you were going to do that coming from your scholarly perspective. Because a startup founder has a very different role in this endeavor, doesn't it? And I'd be interested in your personal reflections on maybe the biggest surprise that you've had.
The biggest surprise, actually, I think for me personally, and I'm working in a very particular space, and I acknowledge that, is actually the divide between the academic world and the commercial world, if I could speak in binaries for a moment, isn't as great as I expected it to be. I think there's an openness to innovation in the way I've talked about in convivial ways there that perhaps naively or otherwise I didn't expect, and that's been quite eye-opening in terms of the way, commercially speaking, they've actually been open to thinking about innovation in this sort of newer way.
I'm hoping we get to dive into that particular idea here a little bit later in the conversation, because I think that's a critical shift for many of us in our thinking. But with that, Yang, I would love to introduce you again and to ask you to take us in a future perspective. Your focus has really been focusing on the future and what we can do. And I know that you are going to be talking to us less with slides and more about reflections in this section. Is that correct?
Sure, yeah, whatever.
Well,
yeah.
It's your stage, sir. Please, take it away.
I've been waiting for AI to take over. That's why I didn't prepare anything. So AI was going to do my slides, didn't do it. Okay, so, but that's just so funny, right? I think educational technology is probably the funniest business in education. If you think about 30 years ago, 1995, around that time, what we were doing in schools, we're trying to connect every student, 5 computers in a classroom. Remember, we were doing all this building, connecting everybody. You know what we're doing now in many countries? We're blocking them. We connect too much. We're banning cell phones in the classroom. Do you notice that? We're banning everything. So why did we do that? It's we're investing in this so much. Now we invested too much. You cannot have your phone or your smart devices in the classroom. It's more of saying that education has failed to compete with technology, right? Don't you think that's basically how we would agree? So we have to block access to any technology. I think AI might have the same kind of situation. So if you think about right now, we have different perspectives on AI, very different perspectives, like they were talking about. Reminds me of Socrates. You guys know Socrates? Everybody knows him. He was illiterate. Therefore, he was anti the invention of writing. He said the invention of writing would corrupt our memory, would corrupt our reasoning, would corrupt everything. Well, maybe he was right. Maybe we should not use slides. That's why you guys should never use slides anyway. So I might corrupt your memory. But think about that. That was 2,000 years ago. If he had been literate, would he say the same thing? I think today in education, when I go around, I say, well, since AI processes natural language, you really don't need to learn to write. I would be beaten to death today if I said that, because most teachers can write, and they are not going to get rid of their jobs. Say, oh God, you don't need to write. How dare you say that? But 2,000 years ago, that was okay, right? He said that. It's fine. And now we respect Socrates, but that's a long time ago. So I think the issue we have today in education is that you look at most AI tools that have been invented is actually to support the broken education system. Is that we want to help you assess better, we want you to teach better, we want you to do this. We are enabling teachers, but we're restricting students' access. But AI is supposed to do that, especially when UNESCO work in different countries. I came out of a very small, tiny, poor village in China. And so every time I go back to the village, it's like traveling about really 5,000 years of history from the US back home. They barely had a road, had electricity a few years ago, but everybody has a phone now, but in a few years it would be different. When I go back there, the students, they could learn a lot faster, a lot better, had access to a lot more information on the phone through AI than the teacher could provide them. But the teacher said, no, you cannot have access to that. So I think our challenge today is to rethink about change. Unless education changes, unless our view of education changes, AI will not have much, won't do much. It's like any other technology. Imagine, when I was joking about educational technology as a founding business, is that, how many years education technology did not really make much difference in schools until COVID. You remember this? We had a business, we had the PhDs, master's degrees, bachelor's degrees. We had a major which created jobs for people who are interested in technology. But really, if you look, most classrooms did not really use it other than doing PowerPoint. But until COVID hit, now we can work from home. That's the basic what we did. So if you think about schools, what needs to change? Here's what I've been thinking a lot about. I've been this year about 13, 14 countries. Wherever I go, every parents, students, they were very nervous. They were anxious. They're worried about what our future can be. So the first thing they want to ask is that, what should we learn? Everybody wants to learn. What should we learn in the age of AI? So everybody comes with a list of skills. Have you seen those skills? Everybody has a list of skills. Literacy skills, thinking skills, problem-solving skills. And you have, of course, traditionally we had the 4 C's. Remember the 4 C's? The 21st century skills. English is a good language with a lot of words with good C's. You can do 4 C's, you can do 4 C's, you can do 5 C's, you can do 7 C's. You can do 10 C's. No, but that's a problem. We always try to make a list for all students, and we expect them to learn the same thing. Our problem with education is that schools actually have kids. Without children, schools would be perfect. Don't you think? I mean, that's our first problem. So if we did not have kids, it would be run perfect. Now, when we have kids, they're alive too. When children are alive, what do you get? You get diversity, you get agency. They think, and often they think too much for our educational system to work. So we don't want them to think. That's why we have this idea of trying to homogenize. We try to test them, assess them. In the end, what we have something called meritocracy, right? We want people to compete. And so in the end, what you produce are people who are different in quality, but in the same area, instead of everybody thrive in their own way. And in that way, that's why the education equity problem can never be solved, because you are forcing people to compete along a narrow, defined curriculum. And you always have, someone is better, they get to go to Oxford or somewhere else, But the worst ones don't go to Oxford, therefore we assign jobs in a different way. And meritocracy was a satire invented in Britain in 1958. Was not even true, but people accept it because I'm smart, I work hard, I deserve better than you. That's not going to work in the age of AI. In the age of AI, our consumption is largely psychological, not physical. So psychologically speaking, we are not enjoying broadcasting, we are enjoying narrowcasting, personalized. So the first thing can we rethink is allow students to have agency to define their own learning, to think about what I am going to be good at. So to develop a jagged profile of talents, which means you would allow people to be bad. Right now in our systems, we don't allow people to be bad. And I have to tell you, the reason I'm standing here was because I was really bad at my village curriculum. I was born in the 1960s. I just couldn't drive the water buffaloes. And that's where, when Chairman Mao started the school, and the teacher came to recruit students, my father said, since you're so bad at farming, why don't you go to school? That's how I started my whole life. So you have to think about, so you have to always think about that. You should be bad at something, okay? You should allow yourself to be bad at something. You have a jagged approach. That's number one. Number two, in the age of AI, we really have to learn one thing, not a whole list of skills. So you have a jagged profile, but one thing that's in common is what I call problem finding and problem solving. Are you able to find problems and solve them? And find problems that's significant, that's meaningful, that matters to you, and find a way to solve that, to develop a habit of that, no matter what you do. Now, you can be great in your own way, great and unique, but who cares? You need to find and solve problems for others. It's very difficult to teach people to find problems, because most of them we find from the UNESCO problems, the sustainability goals. We find we find problems personally relevant. So we ask students to think about, why is the problem important? Number two is that, why do you think you can solve it? Why do you think now is the best time to solve it? And number three, we need to shift from meritocracy towards human interdependence. That is, you solve my problem, I solve your problem, and we develop a way to cultivate a new network of humanity. I can't believe today we're still killing each other. Do you guys notice that? We're proud of developing weapons. How many countries are increasing their national defense or national war efforts? It's unbelievable for human beings in the 21st century to engage in those things rather than working together for each other. So what I imagine is that AI can do a lot. I've been experimenting this model in different countries for over the past 15, 20 years. Now we're developing AI systems to allow personalization, learn to find and solve problems, and develop human interdependence. Unless education changes, AI will be neutralized. And we are neutralizing the power of AI very successfully in education by adopting it, by spending money. So when people say, what are you doing with AI? Well, we are using it. We're using it to reinforce the traditional way. We're not going to change education unless we allow education to change first. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's breathtaking to imagine that I'm sorry, Shafika, that we would be able to stop thinking about solving problems and competing on the problem solution sets and to focus on moving into engagement. I mean, as you were saying that, I realized much of my focus of the work I've done as a learning designer has always looked at finding the problem, and that in many ways maybe we have set ourselves up for some of the situations in which we find ourselves. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that just as we're sitting here, because the fixing of the past probably isn't where you want to be spending much of our time, is it? We really do need for us to be thinking about this new future. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, I mean, in the book, I was really talking about a lot of examples of trying to fix the past, which never been fixed. For example, everybody heard about this thing called growth mindset. So everybody loves, well, let's adopt growth mindset. But really, sometimes growth mindset can be simple stupidity, right? I mean, you keep trying at something when you should be learning to give up. You know, that's why do you keep doing the same thing? You know, right? And so another thing, in K-12 schools, globally speaking, everybody said, oh, let's do social and emotional learning. SEL is very important because kids are depressed. Well, the more you try, the more depressed they are. Why? Because it's new standards. So there's a lot of data showing the old traditional way you can't fix. You know, OECD's PISA scores over the past 20 years, the average has been dipping. You know, said, well, we are supposed to help you learn from others, but the more you learn from others, the worse you get. Why do you fix this? Because a lot of things cannot be fixed. I think in the age of AI, if we could invent the future, we should have, first of all, for example, right now, abandon the readiness concept. That is, we're always getting ready for something. You know, for example, first grade is ready for second grade, third grade is in middle school, for high school, for college. You'll never get to do anything. You're just getting ready for something. But what actually needs is you need to jump in to find and solve problems. We've been running like schools and summer camps, you know, so we allow students to use AI, to work with AI, to identify your strength, your interest, your passion, and then use your interest and passion to find and solve problems, and then further develop. So in our definition, we call learning is doing, doing is learning in the age of AI.
That's fantastic, thank you. One of the things that I wanted us to be able to do here briefly is to have a conversation, for the three of you to have a conversation with each other about this, because I know that each of you has a very strong perspective, and we tried to set this up so that there would be points of difference. But I'm wondering if there are more similarities than differences and just slightly different perspectives at which we're trying to find this new direction. And I want to throw that out to the three of you and see what type of a reaction I get.
Well, we need to learn from the government. They have to tell us what to do first.
Yeah, I think a number of things. I think there's this thing about co-creating futures means that we diss tradition. And I'm wondering a lot about that formulation, because there's so much about traditional, ancestral wisdoms, certainly in African traditions, in China and the East and so on, that is proving to be quite relevant as we co-create our futures. For example, we've been having a lot of conversation around how historically various communities have had harmonious relationships with the environment. And that in an era where the environment is hugely under threat, maybe we can be learning from those traditional, ancestral knowledge systems. But what that means is that we need to pluralize and give space and recognition for these ancestral wisdoms as we think about co-creating futures. And so I wouldn't rush to dismiss tradition. In fact, there's so much there that I think we can learn as we contemplate the co-creation of futures.
Yeah, the co-creation seems to be the place that for learning and development professionals, it's almost as if, I don't want to say we're getting a second chance, But in some respects, it's almost as if we're going to have an opportunity to assert ourselves in a leadership role in ways that perhaps none of us really assumed we would ever be able to take. But that's my hope. That's my personal hope. Niall, I don't know, how are you looking at this, given this conversation? Any?
Just to pick up on that point, I think it's of sort of traditional learning and the kind of innovation sort of eating away at that. And I think it's important to sort of meet people where they are, in that famous phrase, and go from there, whether that's, approaches to pedagogy or whether that's technical integration, whatever it may be. I think there's real value in starting off from where we think people should start, but from where they are and meeting them there and moving from that point through participatory processes I would advocate for.
I've worked work in many different countries. I've seen a lot of organizations. I think this is a time, probably for some of us, we should move away from organizations. Because I think a lot of the organizations are too old, too obsolete, and too corrupted. And I look at the US right now, because I live in the US. Many of you probably know it's not doing well at all. I mean, like, Alan, you're from, I don't have to tell you that, right? But so I think education is supposed to produce better citizens. Don't you agree, right? Supposed to help people who are willing to co-create. But you look right now, there are a lot of authoritarian countries suppressing people. I mean, a lot of countries are not doing well at all right now. Humanity is not doing well. So how do we elevate the human beings to think a better future for us? I think in education, it's very easy to focus on inheriting the past and having the past to control our future. But in essence, education is the business. We are betting people's future using our past experiences. So that's the kind of challenging part. But at the same time, human beings are creative. I think, this might be the moment that new ideas, new paradigms of education can pop up. I would really hope governments, UNESCO, and similar organizations would enable the cultivation of new educational possibilities rather than simply carrying on. Because one of the things we do was really interesting. I think I told you guys this. We're talking to a lot of nonprofit organizations in India, Pakistan, different places. They are always spending money trying to build more schools for kids, right? Or I'm sure in Africa. They said, well, in the US, we're trying to get rid of schools. Here, you're trying to build more schools. What's the purpose? Because if you don't have a school, that might be a good opportunity to build new education possibilities. But now schools said, we want to build more schools so we can be more like we're providing educational access.
As you were talking, I was reminded of a session yesterday where we were reminded that when the printing press, the new technology, was introduced, it was followed by, 30 years of war. But that was also then followed by a renaissance. And so I hope that for many of us looking at this adjustment, change is hard. It's just hard. And we are talking about change and levels that most of us couldn't have ever imagined before. But I keep hoping for that renaissance at the end, and I love the way that you're talking about that.
Well, change is possible. It's like every week, honestly, I probably receive some emails from somebody who is starting some education innovation, some startup companies.
Yeah.
Every week I receive that. But one of the big problems in education is all innovations, they seem to have a tendency we want to conform to the tradition. There's a school in Texas, for example. We are using AI, we're doing this. Look, our kids are doing test scores as good or 3 times better than the traditional approach. I said, why do you want to do test scores? You need a new kind of education. Exactly. So another thing is that a lot of the innovators do not like to work with each other. They say they always want to be the first one to innovate. And then somebody else always asks, I said, okay, I want to innovate, but who else is doing this?
Nobody executes. People love to innovate and make it up, but actually having to go take that and put it to work is far less attractive for most of us, isn't it?
Exactly. Well, most people say, who else has done this? As if someone has done this, you are not the first to innovate. But they say, well, we want to be the first to innovate. I said, no, you don't. You really want to follow somebody else. But it's a very interesting. So I'm sure you guys have a lot more examples like that,
Well, let's do this. Let's see if our audience has some reactions to this, too. We could go on, and we have been, actually. We've had a chance now to talk several times. And every time we do, there's a whole other layer that I want to explore. So let's give members of our audience an opportunity. Do we have microphones nearby? Got a hand up here in the front. If somebody, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, hello. Philip from Germany. I do like the enthusiasm regarding AI. Now, I'm a bit older by now. I've been here for 15 years, and I've experienced a lot of enthusiasm for different topics, particularly at OEB. And if it were for devices, or it would have been for MOOCs, for example, we would already have solved all those problems about 10 years ago, or in the process at least. And, I mean, it took us a while to realize what the problem with social media is, which was a really great idea. And it took us a while to realize that we are creating problems with smartphones, for example, and kids. And it wasn't the technology as such that was the problem, but it was the application, and the application of harmful methods to maximize, for example, for attention, to maximize for revenue and stuff like that. And if we look into AI these days, it's not the most trustful persons who are developing that and driving really the implementation right now. So I absolutely agree that AI could be a tremendously successful tool, but right now it's developing already in quite the contrary direction, taking away complex thinking, trying to replace complex reasoning, and all that. And I wonder, how do we avoid that? And don't repeat the mistakes from the past?
Well, I mean, think about, actually, you were talking printing press. Printing press increased the possibility of witch hunting. That is, I think with the social media, for example, a lot of the research, I'm not defending social media. I don't even have Facebook, okay? I'm not defending it. But what I'm saying, a lot of the research is politicized, and a lot of research is biased, about how bad it has been. There's examples, but every technology has problems. Don't get me wrong. Reading can be quite problematic. You read too much. The other thing, I think, the real solution with any of this is through usage and good education. I don't think we've taught in K-12 schools about social media. I don't think we've ever, even though we have digital literacy, but we did not deal with that. The same thing with AI is that I think the only way to develop truly good AI literacy is through usage. It's a co-evolution process. But again, our schools, traditional schools, are not necessarily doing that, with the critical theory, with the critical analysis. I'm not sure we're doing that. And we then expect children to suddenly have this, do this, right now, I don't think it's reasonable. Schools have to deal with it.
I see a hand here. I see another one here. There you go. Thank you.
This one at the back.
Hi. One in the back, okay.
Coming out of a Scandinavian context where we believe in the whole collaborative learning thing, or at least we used to, both Shafika and Neil touched on some about this AI being highly individualized and personalized learning and personal tutors and all of that. Could you elaborate on how we may drag that in another direction and be more collaborative and work together?
Great question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think that, are you going to take a few questions? Or
why don't we go one by one? Because I think that way we know we will respond as people bring them up. Thank you.
So I think the starting point is that we also want to guard against throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and do acknowledge the spaces and possibilities where AI can be very valuable in reinforcing good values. It's valuable. It can be valuable in terms of restating our sense of ethics, as well as in the cognitive domain, enabling different ways of enhancing our ability to think. And so on the issue around countering this hyper-individualizing phenomenon, we've been exploring possibilities of how to leverage these technology tools to foster communities of practice, professional learning communities, and that has actually worked well in certain disciplines, establishing professional learning communities in mathematics teaching, especially as the mathematics discipline is also shifting in the face of AI. The formation of communities and community learning has proven to be quite effective. And so it is really about ensuring that we frame and that we design interventions with AI that leverages that social capability and community formation. And I think that that is perhaps part of the approach that we need to be adopting, yeah.
Yeah, Niall, please.
Thank you. I think one of the things to think about is the idea of a more able peer. Not AI as your more able peer, but maybe you're working with AI to engage in a problem, perhaps, and you're able then to develop a conversation with someone who has more expertise in that area, or maybe more skills in that area, and the ways in which then you can perhaps both, or as a team, reflect on that development process of how you moved from a position where you may know a little bit about something to where you know more. And so it's about not thinking about the way the AI works as a more able peer, but the way the AI enables new forms of conversation to happen within this community framing. I think that's a nice way to think about it, perhaps.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. There was a hand here. I know there was a hand in the back as well. So let's go here, there, here, and here.
Hi, I'm Brian Mulligan from Ireland. I was a little bit dismayed with the title, Rethinking. I thought, oh my God, more thinking. You know, we need to get the balance. But that's the sort of people we are, isn't it? You know, we find it hard to get the balance between thinking and doing, and I wasn't disappointed. There was a lot of thinking in the presentations, but to be fair to Professor Young, he had some good ideas about doing in the end, and so I thought, well, maybe we should suggest something about what we could do, and he did make the very last sentence. He said, allow us to change. And so I'd make the suggestion, maybe, could our quality and qualifications authorities learn to do quality properly? Because as somebody who's worked with quality people in other domains, quality is about measuring outputs and allowing innovation in the inputs. And in education, our quality systems tend to define inputs. Now, 10, 15 years ago, it was seat time in the US. Now it's going to be, they're going to tell us how we should use AI. I wouldn't like to get into a debate in this place about intelligent design versus evolution by natural selection, but natural selection seems to have beaten intelligent design in a lot of places. So to go back to the idea, I would say we need to be allowed to innovate. Our quality systems need to build that in. And we shouldn't be so arrogant that we know what will work. We just need millions of people experimenting and then pick the best. And so, I mean, from practical point of view, our quality systems need to recognize this. Thank you very much.
If I may, I would just add one example. You know, like everyone knows Arizona State University is from one of the most innovative colleges in the world. And their president, when they started this new innovation, they said most colleges or universities define their quality by who they can exclude. You know, that's why every celebrate, we exclude so many, we only talk. But we want to be proud of who we can include. that changes higher education. That changes, it's about offering opportunities. It's not about how many we've rejected, how many students, but how many students we've included and we can educate. Just want to use that as an example. And last month we were in London. Google DeepMind organized a little forum about AI for learning and teaching. They had me over, join a panel discussion. But one of the things, again, for commercial businesses, they are willing to reach a big market. So they want to reach what is in existence. But you want to have them to invent. It's very difficult in education because they want to have a bigger market. So when I was talking about transformation, is that very few businesses actually want to get into educational transformation because they have very few people. So not only government controls us, but also education, because you are dealing with a tiny group of people who wants to innovate. But I think education truly needs new paradigms and new possibilities. Thank you.
Yeah. If I could quickly just add to that, I think very important point. I think we're at a place also where we need to dispense with just looking at outputs. For example, the test scores is part of that whole dynamic. Writing exams, and behind your question sits a rethinking and reconfiguration of our assessment systems. And our assessment systems are focused on outputs. And we are now having to redesign our assessment systems to focus on learning as a process. So how do you quality assure the learning process? And that, we believe, there's a stronger human dimension. There's so much now being written about the value of people debating face-to-face and not just regurgitating a pristine, perfect essay that was written by an AI. And so there's a questioning around how then do we reconfigure the entire assessment architecture that also focuses on learning as process, not just as output. And that's a deeper conversation. So thank you for opening that up.
Yeah. Niall, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think I'm okay.
I wanted to say, Brian, that the idea of actionability is the thing that I think has to drive all of us a little bit harder than it has in the past. The big ideas are awesome, but being able to do something with it is ultimately going to be the final test, isn't it, for many of us? We've got time for a few questions. It was the one in the back that we wanted to make sure we could catch. Could you raise your hand again? There you go, standing. You are standing. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Anai from South Africa. My question is to Professor Jung. I agree with you that AI challenges education, especially higher education, fundamentally. It's not just about using AI in education. It will change education fundamentally. And you say it's not going to be a homogeneous change, not a one-size-fits-all. It will differ. Meritocracy is out. Human independence is in. And the focus would be more in future on solving problems. But my question is AI not so much better than identifying and solving problems? It's so much quicker to process so much data and come up with so many different solutions than we as human beings can ever offer. So it's that really the focus or potential focus of education in the age of AI? Thank you.
That's a great question.
Thank you. That's a great question. I don't even have an answer. Let me talk to my AI about that. But actually, I think it's this. First of all, when we think about AI, it's just one of many possible sources. It serves as great stimuli in the beginning. And, for example, we've been running this with middle and high school students. When they get in, they can suddenly open up new possibilities for them. And at the same time, of course, everybody needs to be aware of the hallucination, untrue, bias, and all those kind of issues. Another thing I think is that it can train students. Our system, the one we're building, is called YEEAI. It gives students tasks, but students can go through the tasks and very quickly, and then they can reiterate fast, and they can drop certain things, and can discover, so speed up the learning process. And what we are doing now in schools, we use a new model. It's called school within a school. We don't aim to change entire schools. We only want to work with the students and teachers who are willing to change. You know, people who love the past, they can keep the past. Those who are willing to do, who are not benefiting from the existing paradigm, can join the new possibilities. So we've been running this experiment. Even without AI, we were doing this. Now with AI, just speed up. Again, we're not abandoning. I think like Shafika was talking about, it's not either or, only AI. We use a lot of human beings, experts, books, a bunch of resources. So, but I think this is a time for all of us to think about the idea that we overestimate the impact of short-term impact of technologies. We underestimate the long-term impact. Yeah. Because long-term is actually changes a lot more, because right now we focus on the short-term too much.
If I could add to that, I think I was intrigued also by the way you posed your question. And you raised the concept of human independence. And I think we're at an age now where there's so much about what we are doing that we are coexisting with the machine. So we are increasingly more hybridized humans. And the question is, how do we assert a human-centeredness? It's a concept we spew out a lot at UNESCO. So what does it mean to be human-centered in an increasingly hybridized form of human existence, not just with machines, but also with nature? And often we forget the nature equation, because for the machines to thrive, it has to be based also on making use of natural resources. And so that interrelationship between humans, nature, and the machine is becoming a lot more integrated or hybridized, or, you know, the post-digital theorists in the house are talking lots about that. In our imagination, we need to be then thinking of how then do we leverage the machine and engage with nature in a way that fosters human-centeredness, but also not human arrogance. And I think that poses a lot more questions about what it means to have and cultivate human agency within that dynamic, and hence lots more questions than answers at this stage.
If I may just want to add one thing, is that when we are looking at this thing, we always put a term called human in the loop.
Yeah.
So human in the loop with machines as partners, you know, working together.
That's right.
Which aligns with the distributed cognition research, all those kind of things.
Very good. I am mindful of time, and I'm also mindful that when we prepared for this session that I had asked each one of my wonderful presenters here to prepare a small closing. And ask them to think about the one thing that they each wanted you all to take home with you from their presentation, to be able to summarize this so that when you got back to your homes after the meeting, you have something that you could take and start thinking about what you would like to do to start making your changes. So I'm going to go down the line here and give everybody about 3 minutes.
Yes, I think that it's linked to a UNESCO call to action, really. And what we need are better communities of thinkers, better communities of planners and doers. But to do that, we need to have some parts of our global ecosystem that catalyzes and opens up the space for us to be those communities of thinkers. And I think spaces like OEB, e-Learning Africa, Digital Learning Week becomes part of that equation, and that would be our invitation to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ellen. It's a good question. I think for me, the main takeaway is to keep a focus on equity and inclusion. And I think humans, and particularly those in powerful positions, have been quite good over the years of exclusion, if I could put it that way. And you've talked a little bit about exclusion earlier. And I think there's a danger in some ways that we take that way of thinking in relation to technology, So the last question, for example, talked about, AI being sort of an excellent problem solver. But I think we need to be thinking critically about our own agency as learners, all learners, and how we actually think about the relationship, as Shafika has talked about, in this ecosystem between learner, digital tools and resources, and how actually we all can work together towards building those systems in an inclusive rather than exclusionary manner.
I love that. Thank you. No.
Well, I think I really want to say, can we learn to take advantage of diversity? Because even though we've been trying to celebrate diversity, but in many, many cultures, many, many organizations, they still think, my diversity is better than your diversity. And I think the way to celebrate every individual as they are uniquely great and can make a contribution in their own way. So in our model, our education model, we talk about explore me through we. So you can be everybody's self-interested, but you don't have to have the short-term selfishness. So your value is realized through creating value for others. So that can happen in our schools, actually anywhere, I think in colleges, graduate students. So are we able to change that mentality to talk about human interdependence is about your value through creating value for others. And that is how we celebrate others being good in their own way. And this is very difficult. I mean, when Shafiq was talking about assessment, because human beings have a tendency to rank people. We always want to say, are you better than others? We are just different. We're not necessarily better. We're just different, and everybody does things differently in their unique way. So can we cultivate different, unique, great students following who they are?
Great.
Any closing thoughts from our illustrious assemblage?
We basically have time for
I see a hand in the back. If someone could get them the microphone, please, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Paul. So this might be a little bit controversial, but I've been hearing the buzzwords of inclusion, bringing people to the table, and we are all different. But yet that sounds great when the architecture of where we're inviting these people was built based on inclusion. If you do not have a professorship, you're not at the table. We don't want to hear from you if you are a basic worker in a shop. But that basic worker is physically working and needing to do his job or her job, but they're excluded from this conversation. So it makes me think there might be this little academic elitism around it. So how can we truly bring everyone to the table if we start off in a system that's already set up with these biases?
Excellent.
Please.
Yes, thank you for raising that. In the publication that I've mentioned, there's an article precisely on that issue around the inclusion delusion. And that we spew out these words about fostering inclusive systems when, in fact, the people we are talking about are not in the room. And so we need to be rethinking the room and the table. And so behind that sits what are the kinds of strategies for fostering inclusive participation. We in the UN system, we talk often about centering the marginalized. And I'm very aware that we cannot talk about centering the marginalized from a position of privilege, that the privileged cannot speak about or for the people who are excluded, that they need to be in the conversation. Niall was showing a publication called by Spivak on Let the Subaltern Speak, which is that very concept that we need to be designing our systems that are participatory, that are also led by the very people that are meant to be addressing that are facing the issues. And that does mean a redesign of our decision-making architectures, to your point. And so I'm going to throw the question back at you. How would you do that differently? What would you suggest we do to ensure that we have systems that are much more inclusive by design, by intent, in ways where we do have the so-called excluded, marginalized at the center?
Very good. Thank you.
Can I just pick up on that point? So I think just to pick up on the point and answer the question, there is an awful lot of work, including work I've been involved in myself, addressing that exact point, which I'd be happy to chat with you further after the panel, at very grassroots and ground level, but completely acknowledging the elitist and very important sort of a point of elitism you made. If I can just, I guess, have a shout out for the sister conference eLearning Africa as well, which Rebecca runs. So even at this level, there has been a long history of engaging both at policy, higher levels of higher education, but also parallel working on the ground with communities around the world. But again, I'd be happy to speak to you in more detail about that.
Good. That's great, Neil. Thank you. Well, I would like to thank our esteemed panelists for a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for opening some of these issues for our collective thought, because it has to take more than thought. We're going to have to figure out how to get this going. So thank you again. Can we give our panel a round of applause, please?
And thanks to you, Ellen. Great moderation.
Good questions.
This is awesome. Thank you all. I hope you have a rest west of your convention. Thank you so much for being here, and I do hope we keep this conversation going.